Begin today the Gemara on Daf Yud Gimel, Amud Aleph, the Mishnah, a couple of lines down from the top of the Yamud. Sagt the Heilige Mishnah, Ha-Pesach va-Chatos, both the Korban Pesach and Chatos mentioned in the Mishnahis before here, and in the Gemara. These are the two Korbanos that if you have the Kavanah Shaloi Lishma, it completely passels the carbon. So here this Mishnah spells out regarding which Avedis of the carbon does this apply. Sheshachtan Shaloi Lishman, if it was slaughtered, Shaloi Lishma, Kibbel, or he received the blood, Shaloi Lishma, or Vahalach, he walked with the blood, bringing it to the Mizbeach, or Vizarak, or he sprayed the blood on the Mizbeach, Shaloi Lishman. So then this is what passels both of these Karbanis. The Mishnah goes on to say, Lishman v'Shaloi Lishman, if while he's doing any of these Avedas, he has two different things in mind. First, he was thinking that it should be done for this carbon. And then he changes. He thinks that it should be done for a different carbon. Or the opposite, he begins thinking a machshava of lishma, and then he switches that it should be done shaloi lishma. Psulin. It'll be possible regarding all these four avedis and any of these kinds of machshavas, of shaloi lishma. Keitzad lishman v'shaloi lishman. What's an example where first the machshava is lishma and then shaloi lishma? And the Mishnah brings the example for the carbon Pesach. L'shem Pesach l'shleim shlamim. So if he begins thinking it's for the sake of this carbon the Pesach, and then he thinks that it's for the shlamim. Shaloi lishman ulishman, and then what's the opposite? Where he begins with shaloi lishman, then lishman, l'shem shlamim, shechting the Pesach first for the shlamim, and then thinking that it's for a Pesach. That's first lishma, or first shaloi lishma, and then lishma. Shahazevach nifsa barba dvarim. The carbon is passed with these four avedis: b'shchita, or b'kibbel, or b'hiloch, or b'zrike. By the slaughtering, by receiving the blood, by delivering it to the mizbeach, and then spraying the blood on the mizbeach. As we had this already explained before in the Gemara, we had brought the source from the Psukim for all these four avedis that it will become possible with shaloi lishma.
This lishman, the shaloi lishman, is because he's not remembering what carbon he's doing because he's doing so many carbonas. Or he's,
but for whatever reason,
or it
doesn't make a difference. Doesn't make a difference whether it's b'mezid or b'shaygig, whether he's having this mistake or it's b'mezid deliberately. It doesn't make a difference. Either way, if he has the wrong machshava, shaloi lishma, it'll passel the carbon. No. Rab Shimon machsher behiloch. However, Rab Shimon says it's not all these four. Regarding delivering the blood to the mizbeach, it's going to be kosher, even with the machshava shaloi lishma. Why? Because Rab Shimon would say, efsher shaloi b'shchita. The carbon cannot be done without slaughtering it, v'shaloi b'kabbalah, and without receiving the blood in a vessel, and v'shaloi b'zrike, and without then spraying the blood in the mizbeach. So since they are necessary avedis, a machshava shaloi lishma passes. Aval efsher b'loi hiloch. It's possible to bring the carbon without the necessity of then walking with it and delivering the blood to the mizbeach, and that's sheichet b'tzad the mizbeach. You shecht right at the side of the mizbeach of v'zayrik, standing right there with the vessel in his hands and the blood inside. He can spray it onto the mizbeach. Therefore, the machshava of shaloi lishma does not apply here to passel it. Rabbi Elazar says it depends. If he's walking with the blood in a place where it is necessary to walk with it, machshava pesalis, then the machshava shaloi lishma will invalidate the carbon. But if he's walking with it in a place where it's not necessary, ain't machshava pesalis. The machshava will not passel the carbon. And we'll have to wait for the Gemara. We'll see the Gemara will explain what is he referring to? What's considered to be a place that's necessary and what's a place where it's not necessary. Okay, so the Gemara begins with what it said in the first part of the Mishnah. The Kabbalah mi pasla. When you're receiving the blood and you have a machshava shaloi lishma, then will this passel the carbon? As the Mishnah says, that's the second aveda that passels the carbon. But Vatanya, we learned in the Braisa. V'hikrivu, it says in the pasuk right in the beginning of Chumash Vayikra, after it speaks about shechting the carbon, v'shachat es ben abakar, the pasuk goes on to say v'hikrivu b'nei Aaron hakayanim es adam, that then they're makriv the dam, and then it says v'zarko es adam l'mizbeach. They spray it on the mizbeach. So the Braisa says v'hikrivu zu kabbalah sadam. The term v'hikrivu here means receiving the blood. You say it refers to receiving the blood. Maybe it means spraying the blood. That's the simple translation of the ekrivu, that they're bringing it close to the mizbeach, which would sound like spraying it on the mizbeach. So, one second. So the Braisa says that Keshu Aimer Vizarku, when the pasuk uses the term that you spray the blood on the mizbech, Harei Zrika Amer. So that refers to spraying the blood. Homani Mekayim Ve'ekrivu. So if so, what does the term Ve'ekrivu mean? Zu Kabbalah Sadam. It refers to receiving the blood into the vessel, but not the hilach of the dam. The question you just asked, why does it not refer to the hilach of the dam? Rashi addresses here. And Rashi says that the term Ve'ekrivu in the pasuk we find refers dafke to receiving the blood. There is actually a case where it says vehikriv, and it does refer to delivering to the mizbeach, but not over here, because we just said before in the Mishnah that the hilach is not even a necessary step b'chlal, right? So therefore, when it says vehikrivu, and vehikrivu over here is saying that it must be done, so therefore it has to be referring to the Kabbalah of the dam that must be done, and not the hilacha of the dam. Then the pasuk goes on and says, "Bnei Aaron HaKayanim." What's it saying? That it's who's doing this aveda of the Kabbalah of receiving the blood? It's the Bnei Aaron and the Kayanim. Shetehei b'kayin kosher. This aveda must be done dafka with a kayin, and has to be a kosher kayin. It can't be a chalal born from a marriage that's not appropriate, or a balmum. And also b'kli sharis. Kli sharis here means that the kayin himself has to be wearing the big day kahuna. If he's not wearing the big day kahuna, then you can't refer to them as ha-kayanim. Ha-kayanim means that they have their kahuna on them. The kahuna on them, as Rashi brings, you see from the Gemara later, it refers to the big day kahuna, and that's what's called over here in the Lashon of the Gemara, kli sharis. They're wearing their special garments. So we learn this both from the Lashon of Bnei Aaron and HaKayanim. That shows that it have to be kosher HaKayanim, and also with big day kahuna to do the aveda of Kabbalah. That's from where the aveda of the kayanim begins. The shchita, though, could be done by anybody. Amar Rabbi Akiva says he doesn't agree to the source from this pasuk for these two details, that it has to be kosher kayanim and with the big day kahuna, because it says Bnei Aaron HaKayanim. It's just referring to Bnei Aaron, which would be any kind of kayanim, lav dafka kosher kayanim, and lav dafka with the big day kahuna. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva learns this out from another place. From where do I know that from the Kabbalah receiving the blood it must be with a kosher kain ubikli sharis and with the garments of the kainim? Because nemakan bnei Aaron. It says over here that these are the bnei Aaron hakainim. And there's another pasuk later in Parshas Bamidbar where it says, Eila Shmais b'nei Aaron HaKayanim HaMeshuchim. These are the sons of the Aaron HaKayanim HaMeshuchim that were anointed. And the pasuk there goes on to say, Shemila Yodam L'Chayin. So we learn from there as follows. Ma'alalam b'kayin kosher. The pasuk in Parshas Bamidbar it's talking about a kayin kosher because there it's talking about Elazar and Isama. They are kosher HaKayanim. So here as well has to be a kosher kayin. And also the klishara is there, speaking about Elazar and Isama that are wearing their garments as kainim, because it says Hashem mile yodam lekayin. Mile yodam refers to wearing the garments of the kainim. Avkan b'kayin kosher b'klishara. So here as well, the Kabbalah of the blood is the first aveda that must be done by a kayin which is kosher and is wearing the garments of the kainim. Omar Ab Tarfen.
Would I have a havamina that Apostle Kohen can do avoid?
Maybe.
But that's what's being challenged.
We
know it's a double how you do it.
Here's the source. So that's why we're learning Masechet Zevochim. Here's the source. Okay. That's it. Now, Amar Rav Tarfon, so Rav Tarfon.
He was learning that from the same word.
But he's learning it with Gzeira Shavah, though. True, but not from this pasuk itself, only because he has Gzeira Shavah to another pasuk. Amar Rav Tarfon says about the Kabbalah of the dam, receiving the blood. Akapeach es banai. I should lose my children if this would not be true. He wanted to say something with such a strong statement, so he's saying that if this is not true, I would lose my children. If I didn't hear lahavchen heferish ben kabbalah zrike, that there is a distinction to be made between receiving the blood and spraying the blood on the mizbeach. Ve'enu defarish, but I can't explain what is the distinction in halacha between them. Rabbi Akiva came along and said, Aniya Farish, I'll explain the difference in halacha between the two, and he points out three things that are different between the Kabbalah and the Zrika. Kabbalah, when it comes to receiving the blood, the Torah does not consider the thought that you have to be effective like an action that you do to passel it. So even if you have a wrong machshava shalei lishma, it will not passel the carbon. Zrika, however, when it comes to spraying the blood, asaba machshava kemaisa. The thought that you have when you spray it is significant, like an action that could passel the zrika and is passel the whole carbon. That's the first distinction. Another thing, kibloi bachotz ein a chayiv kares. If the avodah that's done outside the Beis Hamikdash, shchutei chutz, which is a chayiv kares. So if you do the avodas that are done inside, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you chayiv kares. But if you receive blood in a vessel outside the Beis Hamikdash, that's not an avodah that is a chayiv kares for. However, zarka bachotz, if you spray the blood outside, then onish kares. Over there will be the einish of kares. The third point, which is different between the Kabbalah and the Zrika, kablu psulin ein chayavin olav. If someone that's pasul, a zar, that's not supposed to do the Aveda, but if he did receive the blood, he's not going to be chayiv misa b'dei shamayim for this, even though it's also for him to do so, but he's not chayiv misa for this. But Zrika psulin chayavin olav. However, Zarku psulin, that is, if the ones that are pasul did the Zrika of the carbon here, they're going to be chayiv misa for this. We had before that this is learned from the Gemara and Yuma, that it has to be an Aveda tama, only an Aveda which completes the Aveda. There, one is chayiv misa, not for an Aveda in between, which is not yet the completion of the kapara of the carbon. Avalei Tarfin, after Rabbi Akiva said these three halachas to distinguish between the Kabbalah and the Zrika, Rabbi Tarfin says, Ha Aveda. Now he uses also a strong term, but a much more positive term. Aveda, I swear, in the name of the Aveda done in the Beis Hamikdash, im hitesa, or another gersa here is im loy hitesa, that or shaloi hitesa, you did not veer off yamin usmoil to the right or to the left in everything that you said. Everything you said was exactly perfect. Ani shamaiti, I heard about the distinction between receiving the blood and spraying the blood, but vainly the farish, but I couldn't spell it out. I couldn't figure out the details. Ate Dairish, and you're expounding on maskim l'shmua b'lashon as maskim l'shmua. You're expounding and you're agreeing exactly to what I heard about this. And b'lashon as amalei, with this expression, he said to Rabbi Akiva, kol ha'peirish mimcha kepeirish mechayev. Anybody that separates from you is like he's separating from life, because Torah is life, and Rabbi Akiva has the right interpretation for Torah, so you should learn Torah from Rabbi Akiva. Now, why is the Gemara bringing this whole lengthy brayse? This is the conclusion of the brayse. But here we see clearly in this brayse, the first point that Rabbi Akiva said is that by the receiving of the blood, we don't consider the machshava to be effective like an action, and it will not passel. Any machshava you have then, seemingly, will not passel the carbon, like when you spray the blood. How does it say in our Mishnah that Kabbalah is one of the four Avedas that if you have a wrong machshava, shaloi l'shma, it passels the carbon? Amar Rav, so Rav answers like Kasher, there's no contradiction here. Ka b'machshavas pigel. This brayse is thinking about specifically the machshava that's called pigel. What's the machshava of pigel? When someone thinks, when he's doing the aveda, that I'm going to do something later, shaloi bizmanai. As we'll see in the continuation of the Gemara, what this refers to is if someone shechts or receives the blood, we're talking about now. He receives the blood thinking that I'm going to spray the blood, shaloi bizmanai. Or I'm going to eat the carbon, shaloi bizmanai, not in its allotted time. That's the machshava of pigel. That kind of machshava is not going to be effective at the time of receiving the blood. And ka b'machshava shaloi l'shma. And in our Mishnah, when it says that a person has a machshava, that it will be effective to pass the carbon, it's not talking about the halach of pigel. It's talking about the kavanah shaloi l'shma, shechting one carbon, thinking that it's for a different kind of carbon that passes the carbon. That machshava will be effective by the Kabbalah, and they don't have the same halacha. By pigel, if one eats from this carbon that was passed through pigel, you chayev kares. It's a much bigger psul. But by a regular machshava shaloi l'shma, it invalidates the carbon, but it doesn't bring a chayev kares if you eat from it. Says the Gemara Deikanami, I'll prove to you this point from the language of our Mishnah. The Tani in our Mishnah, what it includes receiving the blood as one of the steps, that if you have the machshava shaloi l'shma, it passes, it says sha'zevach nifsal. The carbon becomes invalidated. Doesn't use the term that the carbon will become pigel when you have the machshava at that time, because it doesn't. It doesn't get a status of pigel to be chayiv kares if you have the machshava when you're receiving the blood to spray the blood or eat the carbon out of its allotted time. Shema mina, this proves this answer of Rava. But the Gemara asks on this, so machshavas pigel loy pasla b'Kabbalah. Is it true that a thought of pigel, which is this thought of shaloi bizmane, out of its time, is that a kind of thought that will not pass when you receive the blood? But Vatanya, we learned in another brayse as follows. I would think that the person's machshava at the time of the avodah of the carbon would not be effective only when you spray the blood on the mizbeach. Minayim, from where do I know? L'rabba is shchita v'kabbalah. that at the time of slaughtering and receiving the blood, the machshava of the person, and this is for pigul. This Bryce is talking about the machshava of pigul, that it'll be effective then as well. Talmud Laima, so the pasuk says, "Vim he'ochel ye'ochel mipsar zevach shlomov lo yeirotze," that if you'll eat from the zevach of the shlomim, then it will not atone for this. So this double lashon he'ochel ye'ochel is coming to add bidvarim hamivien l'dei achila hakasav medaber, that any step of the bringing of the carbon that is necessary in order to then allow you to eat from the carbon is part of an aveda, that if you have the machshava of pigul during that aveda, it'll pass the carbon. Because it says, im he'achel ya'achel, whatever leads to achila from this zevach shlamim lo yeratze, it will not be atoned for if you have the wrong machshava at that time. So now the shechita, shechting the carbon, then receiving the blood, is a step of an aveda necessary in order to get them to the zrika, that you should be allowed to eat from the carbon. So therefore the machshava of pigul will be mefagel, will cause pigul on this carbon there as well. Now the Brisa contains and says, I would think that then this would include as well with the leftovers of the blood after you spray the blood on the mizbeach, and the leftovers of the blood that has to be poured at the foundation of the mizbeach, or v'aktaris emurim, then the pieces of the carbon that have to be burnt on the mizbeach. So I would think that when you do that aveda and you have a machshava of pigul shaloi bizmane, that it should pass the carbon as well. Talmud Laimar, so on this the pasuk here goes on to say, B'yayim hashlishi lo yeratze, then on the third day it will not be atoned for. And lo yeratze, it's a continuation of the pasuk here, lo yeratze hamakriv v'isai. And the pasuk goes on to say, Lo yechashev, he should not think the wrong machshava when he brings this carbon. So over here, it uses the term hamakriv oisai lo yechashev. This term of hamakriv oisai lo yechashev refers to bringing the blood to the mizbeach. Over here, it refers to the zrike of the dam. So why is it mentioning over here that if you're having the machshava in the wrong time, that's what it means when it says Bayayim Ashlishi. Bayayim Ashlishi over here means that he has the machshava that he's going to eat the carbon on the third day, out of its time. And you're having that machshava when? When he's spraying the blood, you should not think this. Why is it spelling out specifically the spraying of the blood? Now, the spraying of the blood was part of what it's mentioned before, that any step of the carbon that's needed to be done in order to be able to eat is included. Why does the pasuk here spell out specifically the zrika to say that the machshava of pigul at the time of spraying the blood will make it pigul? The answer is because we're comparing to the zrika. To tell you, ma zrika miyuchedes shi aveda uma keves. It's an aveda that's done in the carbon, and it's a must, a step that's a must in order for the carbon for the kapara to take effect. Uma keves kapara. Without this, the kapara is held up. That's until the spraying of the blood. Avkol aveda uma keves kapara. Any aveda which is a must, and without this there is no atonement, it will be included in those avedas that machshava of pigul will invalidate the carbon. Yatsu shvicha shirayim, and therefore this excludes after you spray the blood, when you have to pour the remnants on the foundation of the mizbeach, or v'aktaris emurim, or then burning the pieces on the mizbeach of the carbon. She'eim akvenis hakapara. They are not a must for the kapara, and therefore the machshava of pigul during that time will not be mafagel the carbon. So what do we see here clearly in this Braisa? That the Kabbalah of the dam is a necessary step to be allowed later to eat from the carbon, and therefore the machshava of pigul will passel the carbon then. So how are we saying before that during the Kabbalah of the dam, the machshava of pigul does not passel? So the Gemara explains, Elo loikashia. Some take out the word Elo. In Rashi, there is no Elo here. Loikashia, there's no contradiction between the two Braisas here. Ha the Omar Hareini Sheichit Almanas lekabel dama lemachar. In the case where it says that the Kabbalah of the dam, the first brayse, where it says that the receiving of the blood is not an aveda that will be mefagel the carbon, that's in a case where the person is shechting the carbon, and when he's shechting, what is he thinking? I'm going to receive the blood from this carbon tomorrow. So if his machshava is to receive the blood, it's not practical. You shech today, you receive it tomorrow. But if he had that machshava, correct. But if he had that machshava that he's going to shech the carbon and receive the blood tomorrow, that's not going to invalidate the carbon. That's what the first brisa meant, that the kabbalah of the dam does not invalidate for pigul. That means that the avodah during the shechita, that he's going to receive the blood tomorrow, so he's receiving the blood out of its time, that's not going to be mefagel the carbon. However, in the second brisa, what it's saying is, Ha the Amar over here, and it says that the Kabbalah of the Dam is a stage of the Aveda that will be mefagel the carbon. When the Amar Hareni Mekabel Dama, while he's receiving the blood, he's saying now that I'm going to be receiving this blood, Al Menas Lishpech Shiraim Lamachar, for the condition that I'll spill the remnants of the blood on the Yesod of the Mizbeach tomorrow, and which that is an Aveda that will, so this kind of machshav at the time of the Kabbalah of the Dam, that you'll spill the blood on the Mizbeach, that will be mefagel the carbon. Okay, just to clarify this concept, again? No, even the Shvicha as well. Let me just clarify this. The concept of pigul, we learned it was mentioned before, but over here also it's negate to understand over here what we're talking about. The concept of pigul is referring to achila. If you think that you're going to eat out of its time. Now, who's going to eat? So there's two kinds of achilas for every carbon. There's the achila of the kayin, or the people that eat, and there's the achila of the mizbeach, which is the blood that's placed on the mizbeach. That's also called achila. The mizbeach eats and takes that blood. The achila of the mizbeach includes the zrike, spraying the blood on the mizbeach, and then the shirayim, the remnants that have to be poured on the mizbeach. That's also an achila of the mizbeach. So if a person has a machshava of pigul, that he's going to do it shaloi bizmane, out of its time, what's that machshava referring to? That either he's going to eat it out of its time, so if a carbon could only be eaten for 2 days and a night, he's going to eat it on the third day, or the achil of the mizbeach will be out of its time. What's the achil of the mizbeach? Either the zrike or even the pouring as well. That's an achila of the mizbeach. So therefore over here the Gemara is saying, if a person is receiving the blood and at that time he's thinking that the achila of the mizbeach, which includes also the pouring of the blood, the remnants of the blood on the foundation of the mizbeach, will be done later on, not today, that also is a machshava of pigul that will passel the carbon. That's what the second brisa meant when it said that by the Kabbalah of the Dam there is a halacha of pigul. But if you're thinking when you're shechting that you're going to receive the blood tomorrow, the receiving of the blood is not an achila of the mizbeach. That's just receiving it into a vessel. So since it's not an inyan of achila, it will not passel the carbon. So one of the Talmidim, one of the Rabbanan says to Rave, Ushfichas shirayim v'aktares emurin, when it comes to pouring the remnants of the blood on the mizbeach, or burning the pieces of the carbon of the mizbeach on the mizbeach, loy pasla buhu machshave, the thought of pigul will not pass by these two stages of bringing the carbon. But Vatanan or Vatanya, we learned in Abraise, it says as follows: I would think that the machshava of the person for pigul out of its time will not have an effect only in relation to eating, that he thinks that he's going to eat the meat of the carbon out of its time. How do I know that pigul applies to spilling the remnant of the blood or burning the pieces on the mizbeach? Pasuk uses a double term regarding the consumption of the carbon. So therefore it's talking about two kinds of consuming. Achas achilas adam. The kavana of pigul, machshava of pigul, is either regarding the person that's eating, and achas achilas mizbeach, and it also refers to the achila of the mizbeach that is consuming the carbon. Therefore, we see over here that the Braisa is saying that spilling the remnant of the blood, or the mizbeach that also takes and eats, you burn the pieces of the carbon on the mizbeach, is included in pigul, the double lashon of ha'achal yachal. So the Gemara answers the same point as it said before, lo kasheh, this is not a contradiction. Ha the Omar hareni zayrik al manas lishbayich shirayim lamacha. If when a person is spraying the blood, and then he's thinking that he's going to spill the blood of the mizbeach, the remnant of the blood, tomorrow, so then the spilling of the blood tomorrow is an achila of the mizbeach. So that achila of the mizbeach is out of its right time, and therefore it's going to passel the carbon. On Hada Omar, pigul, it's going to be mefagel the carbon. And Hada Omar, hareni sheifech shirayim al manas lahakterim imuran lamachar. But if while you're pouring the blood on the mizbeach, then the person's going to be thinking that I'm going to burn the parts of the mizbeach out of its time, that's not going to passel the carbon. And the reason is because over here you see in the Gemara that there's another condition for the inyan of pigul to take effect, which the Gemara already mentioned before. The inyan of pigul only takes effect if you think the machshava of pigul during an aveda, which is ma'akiv the kapara. When you are pouring the remnant of the blood on the mizbeach, that's not an aveda which is ma'akiv the kapara. So what's the conclusion of what we see here in this Gemara regarding the inyan of pigul? This is the first place we have with the sugya of pigul, which will be a continuation, and then the main sugya of pigul is also in the second perek. But just to conclude, you see regarding this machshava of pigul, which is specifically machshava chutz lizmanoi, what's the two conditions to pass the carbon? It has to be only if you're having this thought during an aveda, which is ma'akiv the kapara, which is only until the zerika. And what is your machshava regarding the achila? Whether the achila of the mizbeach or the achila of a person, that achila will be shaloi bizmanoi. That's what will pass on the carbon. Amar Rabbi Yehuda berei de Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda the son of Rabbi Chia says, this is continuing regarding pigul, that Shamaiti, I heard shetfilas etzpa mifagelas b'chatos pnimis. The kohen that has to dip his finger into the blood and then spray with his finger onto the mizbeach. This is a unique halacha by the carbon chatos that you don't find by other karbanis, that has to be done with tava let's boy badom, that he has to do it with the finger. So if he dips his finger into the blood, so that itself as well mifagelas b'chatas pnimis. If he's thinking with the wrong machshava that I'm dipping my finger into the blood in order to spray the blood or eat the carbon out of its time, the machshava of pigul, it'll passel even just by having that machshava by dipping the finger into the blood. Shama Ilfa heard this halacha. Amra kamei the Rav Pada, and he said it in front of Rav Pada, and Omar Rav Pada said, how could you say that this is true? Because klom lamadnu pigul ela mishlamim. In the pasuk, where do we learn the halachas of pigul from? A lashon in the pasuk, which gives the example for the carbon shlamim. That's what the pasuk is talking about. It says there, you see at the pasuk that the pasuk the Gemara quoted before. And he thinks that he's going to eat it on the third day. So it's talking about the carbon shlamim. That's where we learn the halachas of pigul from. If so, ma shlomim ain't tfilas etzba mifagelas b'am. By the carbon shlomim, there's no such a thing that dipping your finger into the blood and you have a wrong machshava of pigul will be mifagel the carbon, because there is no dipping of the finger into the blood by shlomim. You just spray the blood directly from the vessel onto the mizbeach. So avchata, so too by the chatas, where there is that step of dipping your finger into the blood, but ain't tfilas etzba mifagelas b'am. The dipping of the finger is not a significant act for itself to say that the machshava of pigul will be mafagel the carbon there. That's the question that Rav Pada asked. So the Gemara says on this, or responds to this, V'chi akel mishlamim lamdu or lamadnu. Do we learn everything just from the shlamim itself? If so, if you're going to say that we have to compare exactly to the carbon shlamim, so then you should continue and say as follows: Ima shlamim, just like I see by the shlamim, shaloi lishman ein moitzi midei pigul. Oh, so before I translate this, the halacha by pigul is, in order for the carbon to get this status, this unique status of pigul, and like I mentioned, when it becomes a pigul, then if you eat from it yichayev kares, that's only if it's a kosher to carbon otherwise. If there's already another invalidation with this carbon and another psul, then the psul of pigul cannot take effect. Okay, so therefore now the Gemara says, when it comes to shlomim, if he thought when he's bringing the carbon shlomim, shaloi lishma, that I'm not bringing for the shlomim, I'm bringing it for something else. Ein moitzimidei pigul, that will not exclude from the pigul to take effect on this carbon. Why? Because as we learned before, when you have the machshava shaloi lishma for a shlomim, it doesn't invalidate the carbon. The owner did not fulfill his obligation, but the carbon remains kosher. So therefore, since the carbon is otherwise completely kosher in itself, so the psul of pigul takes effect. So if so, I should say the same thing. Av chatas shaloi lishma, by a carbon chatas, now chatas is different. Chatas, when you think the machshava shaloi lishma, it does invalidate the carbon. But if I would compare to shlamim, I would say that chatas as well, when you have the machshava shaloi lishma, ein moitzi midei pigul, this should not exclude it from becoming pigul. How could this be? Once it has the psul of shaloi lishma, it's not kosher other than the pigul, so the pigul should not take effect. So therefore the Gemara concludes, what's the answer to this? That even though the pasuk says the halacha of pigul by shlomim, we're not just simply learning it out comparing to shlomim, which is what's usually called the binyan av, that we're just learning from shlomim comparing to other karbanis. Rather, miribuya dekroi ka'asya. There's an extra word in the pasuk that teaches me that the halacha of pigul is not only by shlomim, but it's also for other karbanis as well. And if it's learned from a riboy, I don't have to compare to all the details that it says by shlomim. So hachanami, regarding the dipping of the finger by the chatas into the blood, miriboy the krakas, see, since it's learned from a riboy, so therefore I don't have to say that just like by shlomim, there is no dipping of the finger, so there's no pigul there, so the same should be by the chatas. Not necessarily by the chatas, since the dipping of the finger is an aveda for itself, you could say that it's significant that the machshava of pigul will passel it. Okay, this is the discussion of this Inyan in one version. It will be that Rav Yehuda Berei, Rav Chia said this, and Bar Pada that asked the question, or Rav Pada, and the Gemara answered it. Only by the Chatas, correct, not by other Karbanis. Now here the Gemara brings another version of this discussion, which begins the same, but then the conclusion is a bit different. Omer Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Ba'aliyah zu, in the second floor, we were sitting and discussing the subject, Shamaiti, so I heard the halacha, that Tvilas Etzba Mifageles, that when you dip the finger into the blood and the machshava of pigul, the kain has the machshava of pigul, at that time it will be mefagel the carbon. So he said the same halacha like Rav Yehuda Berei that Rav Chia said. So now Toy bought Rav Shimon ben Lakish that heard this, so he was wondering about this. That's one pirish of Toiba. Another pirish of Toiba means that he was sort of smelling out to see what's the concept here. It didn't make sense to him. Why not? So he asked the same question as the Gemara said before. The source of pigul comes from the pasuk where it speaks about the shlomim. If so, ma shlomim aim tfilas etzba mefagalas ben. By the shlomim, there is no dipping of the finger, and therefore there is no pigul regarding this. Av chatas aim tfilas etzba mefagalas ben. So by the chatas, even if there is a dipping of the finger, it should not be significant that the machshava of pigul should be mefagal the carbon. So the Gemara says, but v'chiyah kail mishlamim lamdu. Do we learn everything from shlamim? If so, ima shlamim shloi l'shman ein meitzim b'dei pigul. By the shlamim, if you have the machshava shloi l'shma, it will not exclude from the psul of pigul that must be exclusively when it's only pigul. So av chatas shloi l'shma ein meitzim b'dei pigul. Apply the same to chatas when the machshava shloi l'shma does passel the carbon. It still should not exclude from pigul. You can't make this comparison to shlamim. So therefore, Amar Rabbi Yosef ben Rab Chanina explains, and here he gives a little bit of a different explanation why by a chatos it'll be different than the shlomim. So that he says, yes, you could say that akol mishlomim lomdu, that you do learn everything from the shlomim, and that's, as I mentioned before, you learn it with a binyan av, which means we just compare it to the shlomim, even if there's no extra word in the pasuk to teach that pigul applies to other karbanis, but we just learn it with a binyan av comparing to the shlomim. And then I say as follows: what do I find by shlomim that I compare now to the chatos? By the shlomim as well, even if shaloi l'shma will not passel the carbon, but there is a certain machshava that will passel the shlomim. What is that? If a person does the aveda by the shlomim and he thinks that I'm going to eat it outside of its right place, let's say outside of Yerushalayim, that's the machshava of chutz l'mekaymai. That kind of machshava will passel the shlomim. This is not pigul though. Pigul is only chutz l'zmanai, but chutz l'mekaymai will passel the shlomim. So once you have that machshava of shaloi b'mekaymai regarding the shlomim, it cannot become pigul anymore because it's not exclusively the pigul. Ushaloi l'shmai paisel b'chatas. Now regarding the chatas, not only shaloi b'mekaymai passels it, even just shaloi l'shma, not for the sake of this carbon, also passels by the chatas. So that's the comparison to the shlomim. Just like the machshava of that I'm going to eat it out of its right place will passel the shlomim. And therefore, pigul, this now removes the possibility of it becoming pigul. So chatas has a different rule of what passels it, and that is the shaloi l'shma that will passel the chatas. Pigul. It'll take it out from the possibility of becoming pigul. That's the comparison. So true, they're not exactly the same, but we're comparing the concept that by the shlomim, whatever will passel it, otherwise, without pigul, then will not allow pigul to take effect. And similar regarding the chatas. There it's shaloi b'mekaymai, that's by the shlomim, and by the chatas, it's even shaloi l'shma, will also passel the carbon, and therefore there'll be no pigul anymore. But Rabbi Yirmiyah does not agree to this kind of comparison. He says, mitzida tavra, right over there, right at your side, the receipt or the answer to your explanation for the comparison from the chatas to the shlamim is there. You can't compare these two kinds of psulim. When it comes to this machshava of eating it out of its right place, that passes the shlamim, that's a much stronger psul. Why she came neig b'chol hazvachim? This is a kind of psul that is by any carbon you bring. However, the machshava of shalei l'shma that passes, that only invalidates the carbon itself by the pesach and the chatas. So who says over here, when you have this machshava, it'll then exclude from the psul of pigul that cannot take effect? So therefore, what should you say in understanding the comparison of the chatas to the shlomim regarding the halacha of pigul? Davar ha-paisel behen maitzian midei pigul. Something that invalidates the carbon without pigul, so that excludes from it becoming pigul. Davar ha-ma'akiv mehen mevi'an l'dei pigul. Any aveda that's done in the stages of the carbon, which is a must in order to bring the kapara or to finish the carbon, that is a stage of aveda that if you think your machshava of pigul at that point, that will cause pigul. Those are the two rules about pigul that I see by the shlomim. So hachanami, I take those two general rules and I apply it by the chatas as well. Davar ha-paisa ba maitzi midei pigul. If this carbon is already pasul, otherwise that will take out the concept of pigul. And davar ha-ma'akiv ba, the aveda done with the chatas, which is a must that has to be done for the kapara of the carbon, mevi'u lidei pigul. The machshava that you have at that time will cause pigul. Which means the Gemara here is concluding that we don't have to compare it to the shlamim in the details mamish regarding the specific halacha of what exactly would passel the shlamim, and then that's not the same by the chatas. I compare it in the general sense, the two general rules that the Gemara just mentioned. That's the comparison that I apply from the shlamim to the chatas for the halacha of pigul. So this is a little bit of a different explanation of the Gemara said before. And therefore, it would apply also to the tefillah be'etzba. Since the tefillah be'etzba is a stage that has to be done for the carbon chatas, for the avodah of the carbon chatas to be completed properly. Therefore, that tefillah be'etzba will be an avodah that if you have the machshava of pigul, that will pass all the carbon. Amar Rav Mari says, Afanan nami tanina. I can bring you a source for this that we see in a Mishnah, that the dipping of the finger is a kind of avodah by the chatas, that the machshava of pigul will pass it. Because the Mishnah says in Menachos as follows: all the halachas of pigul by a carbon, it's learned out, it's compared. Menachos are compared to karbanis, that the halachas of pigul applies by a mincha as well. And by mincha it says, klal, here's the rule: kol ha-kaimetz, when you do the kemitze, that's the first aveda. When you with your fingers you separate a portion of the mincha, and then v'naisen bekeli, and then you place that piece of the kemitze into another vessel, and then v'hamoilech, you bring it to the mizbeach, and then v'hamakter, when you burn it on the mizbeach. These are the four avedis regarding the carbon mincha, that if you have a machshava of pigul, it'll be mefagel the mincha. Okay, so now the Gemara explains what are these four avedis, and we are learning this all from a carbon. We're comparing it to the stages of the bringing of a carbon, that the same applies to the mincha, that it will be pigul. So the Gemara here explains the comparison. We can understand the comparison of the kaimetz. Hainu sheichet. That's similar to slaughtering the carbon. You just like you shecht and remove, or separating the head, so you're removing a piece on the top of the mincha. Moilech, hainu moilech. Then you deliver it to the mizbeach, like by the blood that you deliver it to the mizbeach. Then makter, when you burn this on the mizbeach, so nami hainu zaydik. That's the counterpart to the spraying of the blood on the mizbeach by a carbon. But hello, there's one thing here that's not exactly the same to how it is by a carbon. Nice and bekeli, this that it says that you then take the zrika that you have in your fist and you place it into another vessel. My neo, what is this compared to in what's done by a regular carbon? If you'd say that it's similar to receiving the blood when you shecht, also, so you're receiving it in another vessel, but it's not the same. Midami, how could you compare them? Hasam memele. And over there, by the blood, when you shech the blood, when you shech the animal, that is, the blood splashes out automatically, and you just hold the vessel there, and the blood just goes into the vessel automatically. Hacha, over here, though, it's done differently. Iu kashakel verami. First, he removes the kemitze from the mincha, and then he has to take it and throw it into another vessel. So he's doing an act, a separate act over here, that you don't find this separate act that's done by a carbon. So therefore, how do we know that this separate detail, this separate act done by the mincha, the halacha of pigul should apply here as well, since the halacha of pigul is learned from karbanis, but this is sort of a separate act by the mincha which cannot be compared to a carbon with an animal. So what's the answer? Why does the halacha of pigul apply to this detail of the mincha as well? The answer is, since by the mincha, it's not enough if this is not done, it's a stage, it's necessary. So al karche aveda chashuvi. So this is considered to be a significant aveda, and therefore the machshava of pigul will invalidate it. Like we said before, anything that's significant in the stages of the kapara, of the carbon, so that's going to passel. So if so, applying now back to the point that we're talking about over here regarding the carbon chatos, that the kayan has to dip his finger and then spray with that. So here as well, kiven delay sagi, delay avidlay, since it's not enough if this is not done, so karche hainu haylacha. So it's going to be part of the haylacha. Just like the haylacha, it is considered to be a stage that must be brought to the mizbeach, and therefore, if you have the machshav of pigul, then it'll passel. So similar regarding the dipping of the finger, it's another by the chadlis, it's another step of bringing it to the mizbeach that will passel the carbon. So therefore, I see this from the mincha. So even if I can't compare it to the shlomim exactly, but as long as it's a necessary step that must be done, it'll passel, just like or it'll be mafagel, just like by the mincha. Here the Gemara's lashon is interesting. The Mefarshim point out, it says hainu haylacha. This is an additional detail the Gemara did not say before, that the dipping of the finger into the blood by the chatos is considered to be like part of the haylacha, part of the delivery to the mizbeach. But the Gemara says, though, this is not from the carbon mincha, you don't have a raya. There's no proof from there. I can tell you that when you place the kemitze into the vessel, this is similar to the receiving of the blood by a behemoth when it's shechted. And this that you're asking, that by the carbon of the animal, the blood comes out automatically and you just hold the vessel there. And Hassam, by the minche iyu kashako v'yoev, over here, he takes the kemitze and does an act to place it into a new vessel. So it seems like there's an additional detail here. But it's not. Kiven the idi v'idi, matan kelihu, both are compared in the sense that you're placing either the blood or the kemitze into a new vessel. Mali memela, mali kashako v'yov. There's no difference if it just happens automatically or he's doing an act and placing it into the vessel. It's the same thing. And therefore, it's not considered to be another detail that I don't find by a carbon. So you can't prove that there's another detail that I don't find by the carbon and it'll still be pigul. Why? It must be that it's chashuv, because it's a necessary aveda, and then prove from here regarding the dipping of the blood as well that it's a necessary step and therefore it'll be pigul. So therefore from that place of carbon mincha, there is no raya to this halacha.